If you only looked at the headline, you might think this story is about a sudden diplomatic clash between the United States and Canada over the Arctic. A dispute over shipping lanes, resources, maybe some naval maneuvering in cold water most people will never see. But when you step back and look at the economic structure underneath it, the real story becomes much bigger. What we may actually be watching is a moment where dozens of countries appear to be testing how far American economic and geopolitical power really extends in a world that is no longer unipolar. And if public reporting around this kind of scenario is even partially accurate, it tells us something important about how alliances, markets, and resources interact inside the global capitalist system. The surface narrative tends to frame situations like this as a personality clash between leaders or a sudden diplomatic escalation. One government makes a territorial claim, another government pushes back, and then the media focuses on who looks strong and who backs down. But that framing hides the deeper machinery that usually drives these conflicts. Shipping routes through the Arctic are not just about maps and sovereignty. They are about trade flows, energy supply chains, mineral extraction, and the long-term control of infrastructure that global capitalism depends on. As the ice melts and new routes open, whoever influences those routes influences billions of dollars in logistics and resource access. So when you hear about dozens of countries aligning themselves behind one government in a territorial dispute, the important question is not simply who supports whom. The real question is why so many states might see economic advantage in coordinating their position. Governments do not usually risk confrontation with a superpower for symbolic reasons. They do it when the incentives line up. When trade advantages, resource contracts, and financial stability mechanisms start appearing in the same conversation, what we are really looking at is an emerging coalition built around shared economic interests. And this is where the deeper pattern begins to appear. If a group of industrial economies, trading blocs, and resource importers all suddenly decide that supporting a smaller partner state could restructure access to energy, minerals, or shipping infrastructure, that alignment stops being just diplomacy. It becomes market strategy at the scale of nations. And once markets enter the picture, the conversation shifts away from patriotic narratives and towards something much more structural. Who controls resources? Who controls trade routes? And who ultimately captures the profit streams that flow through them? Once you start looking at it that way, the diplomatic language around sovereignty and international law begins to sit alongside a much more practical set of incentives. If multiple countries see a chance to secure long-term access to Arctic resources or shipping routes under stable agreements, supporting the state that controls those resources can suddenly make economic sense. Public reporting around these kinds of geopolitical moments often emphasizes the drama of alliances forming overnight, but in reality, the groundwork for that cooperation is usually laid by years of trade relationships, energy dependency, and financial interconnection. Think about how modern industrial economies function. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and much of Europe depend heavily on imported energy and raw materials to keep their manufacturing sectors running. Rare earth minerals, natural gas, and other strategic inputs are not just commodities. They are the foundation of entire supply chains. If a situation emerges where access to those resources could be secured through long-term agreements with a politically stable partner, that possibility alone can reshape diplomatic behavior. Governments are constantly calculating how to guarantee those flows for decades into the future. From the outside, it can look like a sudden geopolitical earthquake, but the incentives have been building quietly beneath the surface. Many countries have spent years worrying about supply chain fragility, volatile alliances, and the risks of overdependence on any single dominant power. In that environment, a dispute involving resource sovereignty can become a kind of pressure valve for broader anxieties inside the global system. Supporting one side may signal something larger about the desire to diversify economic power and reduce vulnerability. And notice how quickly financial mechanisms enter the conversation whenever geopolitical coalitions appear. Currency support arrangements, trade preferences, and coordinated market access are not symbolic gestures. They are tools that states use to stabilize each other's economies during periods of tension. When several governments are willing to extend those tools simultaneously, what they are really doing is constructing a financial safety net that allows a partner state to withstand retaliation. That kind of coordination only happens when participants believe the long-term economic payoff could outweigh the immediate political risk. At that point, we have to ask the uncomfortable question that mainstream coverage rarely emphasizes. If a confrontation like this escalates, who actually absorbs the cost? Because it is almost never the political leadership class that carries the burden. Trade restrictions, retaliatory tariffs, supply chain disruptions, and financial countermeasures eventually land somewhere very concrete in everyday life. They show up in higher prices, unstable employment, slower economic growth, and uncertainty in industries that depend on international markets. Think about what happens when trade relationships tighten or shift. Companies that rely on cross-border supply chains suddenly face delays and cost increases. Energy prices move, transportation costs ripple through logistics networks, and consumer goods become more expensive. Workers in export industries may find their jobs tied to decisions made thousands of miles away in diplomatic negotiations. Farmers, factory workers, and small business owners are usually the ones who feel those shocks first. The geopolitical story might be framed as a battle over sovereignty or prestige, but on the ground it often translates into ordinary people navigating a more volatile economy. And this is where the structure of capitalism quietly shapes how these crises unfold. Large multinational corporations often have the flexibility to reroute supply chains, hedge against currency fluctuations, or shift production across multiple regions. Smaller firms and workers rarely have that kind of insulation. So while geopolitical conflicts are presented as national struggles between states, the internal distribution of risk within those countries is very uneven. Some actors gain strategic leverage or long-term contracts, while others experience insecurity and rising costs. The media conversation tends to focus on leaders, strategy, and dramatic diplomatic moments. But what it often fails to examine is the economic architecture that made the confrontation possible in the first place. The competition over Arctic resources, shipping routes, and trade networks is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening inside a global system where markets, corporate supply chains, and financial institutions push governments towards certain choices. When you follow those incentives, the conflict starts to look less like a sudden accident and more like the predictable outcome of a system organized around resource control and profit flows. And that brings us to the deeper lesson that stories like this can reveal if we pay attention to the structure rather than the spectacle. In the mainstream narrative, these moments are often framed as diplomatic surprises or sudden political drama. A leader miscalculates, an alliance forms, tensions rise. But when you look at the incentives that shape global capitalism, these confrontations often follow patterns that have been building for years. Control over resources, infrastructure, and trade routes becomes increasingly valuable as economies grow more dependent on complex supply chains. When new strategic spaces open up, like Arctic shipping corridors or untapped mineral reserves, governments and corporations naturally move to position themselves around those opportunities. The public conversation rarely focuses on that structural logic. Instead, the debate gets pulled into personality conflicts, patriotic rhetoric, or short-term political wins and losses. But the underlying question is much bigger than any single leader or country. It is about how a global economic system organizes power around ownership, access, and extraction. Whoever influences the flow of energy, minerals, and transportation networks gains enormous leverage over the broader economy. And once those stakes become visible, alliances can shift in ways that would have seemed unimaginable a decade earlier. What we can say with confidence is that moments like this expose the tensions inside a world economy that is becoming more multipolar and more competitive at the same time. Countries are trying to secure their supply chains, reduce dependency, and lock in long-term advantages wherever they can. That does not necessarily mean open conflict is inevitable, But it does mean the incentives pushing governments towards strategic competition are very real. So when you see headlines about sudden alliances, territorial disputes, or economic ultimatums, it helps to pause and ask a different set of questions. What resources are involved? Which industries depend on them? Who stands to gain stable access, and who risks losing it? And perhaps most importantly, who ultimately bears the cost when these struggles reshape the global economy? If you want to keep unpacking how economics, class power, and global systems shape the stories we see in the news, make sure you stay engaged with the channel. Like the video, subscribe if you have not already, and share your thoughts in the comments. The more we examine these patterns together, the easier it becomes to recognize them the next time they appear.